Of all things, a few months before he died, I had this conversation with Mark, and he bared his heart and said, "I just don't want people to forget me." And that he said that, it's like it spread eagled itself over my soul to think, like, how could anyone forget you? I will never forget you. Your patience, you've affected them, you've saved lives, you've touched the family, you have a church family with neighbors, etc. And yet, because he said that, I had maybe more intention than most people that
Yeah.
making sure that he was not forgotten was really important. It was as though he handed me a mission.
Hello, my grieving friends. It's your host, Lisa Keefauver here. Welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Just in case you're new to the show, yeah, it's a podcast all about grief. Over these past 6 seasons, we've been exploring the expansiveness and the pervasiveness of grief in our lives because, fun fact, 100% of us will experience a loss multiple times in our lives. But what I've learned in my 20 plus years as a social worker and the more than a decade I've spent now as a widow is that when we lean in, hold space, bear witness for one another in the most difficult seasons of our lives, that's where healing, connection, and belonging happens. Now, my guest today understands that very well. She is a fellow widow who's made her mission to take the remembering part of the grieving journey to new heights. Jennifer Hassel was a lawyer who then became a registered nurse after living through her husband's terminal illness, their mutual suffering, and her own grief. Writing from what she knows through firsthand experience, she's been published in the Philadelphia Lawyer, Joyful Life magazine, The Sun, and even the local newspaper of her hometown around professions and practices around nursing. Now, in today's heartfelt conversation, we discuss her new book, Badass Grief. And you know that I love that title the minute I heard about it. Jennifer shares her early experiences with grief, the legacy of her husband, Mark, and how she navigated parenting while grieving. She emphasizes the importance of living fully in memory of loved ones and the challenges of finding happiness amidst sorrow. Jennifer understands deeply the importance of finding agency, the role of purpose in navigating grief, and the nonlinear path that we take. Our conversation highlights the significance of acknowledging hard feelings while also recognizing moments of growth and hope, too. You guessed it, more about the both and of grief. Friends, I am so excited to welcome Jennifer Hassel to the show. If you are watching on YouTube or if you see my social media post, you know that she wrote this book called Badass Grief, Changing Gears, Moving Forward. And you know, when I saw the title Badass Grief, I found a kindred spirit here at Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. So Jennifer, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, listeners heard at the top of the show a little bit about your story, and we're going to dive into um, what you recounted in your book, Badass Grief, the story of loving Mark, of losing Mark, of the wild adventures that you've been on in the wake of his loss and, living into life in the wake of loss. But I wanted to ground our conversation, of course, no surprise to folks who've been listening to the show for some time, in the questions I ask each guest in order for us to all become more aware of the grief beliefs we hold and whether or not they serve us or not. And most of us learn that from an early loss in our childhood. So just inviting you to think about a early loss, doesn't have to be a death loss, but could be. And how are the adults in your life modeling grief? What do you think that taught you back then about
Hmm.
what that means grief should or shouldn't, and I'm using air quotes there, look or feel like? And did that serve you or not when you faced this profound loss, which is the death of your husband? Yeah. So an early loss memory?
Yeah, my first loss, that the first thing I remember occurred when I was probably about kindergarten age. And what happened was, a neighbor came over to visit my mom, and I'm thinking she was about my mom's age, although everybody looks so old when you're 5, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Well, they're sitting in the living room talking, and I don't remember how I knew this, but I knew that that woman had house fire, and that as part of the house fire, she had lost at least 1 child, maybe even 2.
Oh,
But knowing this and wanting to be helpful, I remembered, I know we have a picture of that child. So I went to another room and I fished through the door where the pile of photographs was, and I found it. I was so proud of myself. And I came back and I handed this photograph, kind of inserting myself in the adult conversation, and I handed it to
yeah.
the mom, and silence. And then she looked at the photograph and nobody said anything, but tears, silent tears, started streaming down her cheeks. And I knew somehow I'd done something wrong, but I didn't know what it was. And nobody, like my mom, I don't remember my mom attempting to comfort her. I don't remember her expressing how sad she was or even feeling that she had the permission to cry, like to
Yeah.
sob. It was
Yeah.
just this silent tears. And what I took away from that is that when somebody dies, don't mention it. It makes people sad. It makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that was the culture at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
my mom did the best she could. I didn't learn until after she died. I mean, her mother had died when she was in her 20s. She had
Mm,
lost a brother when she was a teenager, but we didn't talk about those things.
yeah.
How
Did you
sad.
not talk about the deaths, but also not talk about them either?
Correct.
Or more
We
just
did
not talk about you know what I mean? Like, grandma used to X, Y, and Z, or was there really just kind of no mention of those
no
family
mention.
members?
Yeah, there
Yeah,
was no mention of grandma at all and no
yeah,
mention of this
yeah,
brother, although I knew his name.
yeah,
And that was kind of that again, how sad for them that they didn't have the tools or permission or even willingness to talk about what was uncomfortable, which was, we
yeah,
love these people. They're gone, but we still miss them.
yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that story and this sort of the innocent, but I think really wise, intuitive 5-year-old version of you who knew, like, I want to reconnect you with your child. Here's a picture. Like, let's talk about them or look at them. But
Mhm,
also the fact that, your family, much like most families in the West, especially of a time before I would say this kind of current generation, but even now,
mhm,
lived in a culture that believed that moving on was a thing, which meant leaving everything behind, including our pictures and topics and conversations of our people. And that's what's quote unquote what's best for us. So I always will like to remind with this disclaimer, it's practically in every episode, is that we operate with a set of beliefs about all kinds of things, not just grief.
mhm,
It becomes sort of subterranean, sort of subconscious. And the only way we are going to shift generationally or even in our own generation what we believe about things which impacts how we act and show up in the world and how and our well-being is to examine what do we believe in the first place. So
mhm,
the invitation for you to explore that and to share that story, which I appreciate, and to share that fact that even that your mom didn't talk about her own parent loss or sibling loss was not to rage against them or criticize them, but just to put into context. We teach things. That's such an important example. No one said in that story, don't talk about your person. It was more by implicit omission.
yes.
And those are the things that I'm always inviting all of us when I work with grievers one on one, when I teach the courses, when I, talk from the stage is it's not just that people are going around saying, don't talk about your brother. It's making everybody sad. Although people do say that, unfortunately. They just change the subject every time you talk about your brother.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And so I appreciate you recognizing that that context, that training, that belief system was there in the backdrop when you moved into adulthood and came face to face with what I'm presuming has been one of the most profound losses of your life. So speaking of which, I want to sort of pivot our conversation to a little bit where you start early on in the book, helping us get to know your beloved Mark. And just before we talk about him and your life together, his diagnosis and his death, of course, I want to bring Mark into the room. So, what do
Thank
we
you.
need to know more about Mark besides I gather was a big adventurer too?
He was. When someone says, "Oh, my husband was an incredible person," but he really was. I mean, he was smart and funny and self-deprecating. Um, he was a doctor. He trained in dermatologic surgery. That meant he did the skin cancer surgeries,
Yeah.
laser surgeries, and he had the guts in 1990 when he finally finished all his training to open his own practice. I mean, that speaks of the kind of person that he was because not many people would have done that,
Yeah.
but he did. And he was a he just lived life to the fullest. And he did like adventures. He was a natural athlete. He skied, he swam, did it all. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And your love story, you were a lawyer already by the time you met or became a lawyer once you were together? Is that
I was a lawyer. I
already?
actually
Okay.
a baby lawyer. I just finished law school when we
Okay.
met.
When you met. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and you know, you just named that like live fully, that Mark lived fully. And I was remembering from a passage in your book about sort of looking at the back of the program, which I'm jumping ahead a little, but we'll come back
Mhm.
around to from Mark's service and the
Yes.
sort of bullet points, as it were, not to sound so crass, but were kind of like what were the messages or lessons from Mark and how he lived his life. And number one was live fully.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what Lisa's referring to is in Mark's funeral program, our pastor said that he was inspired to remember 7 things about Mark. And I still remember them because they were bullet
Yeah.
points and yet good things to remember. And the first is live fully, laugh often, serve others, suffer courageously, be faithful, love nature, love God. And that really was a, it did summarize who he was and the
Yeah.
things he believed in.
It's so beautiful. Now, uh, uh, I'm wondering if you can bring us back to this time you were living kind of, as you said, you would say he's the most amazing husband and people couldn't even imagine, but he really was. And as I read your story a little bit, it also felt like you were living this sort of most amazing life. You had began to have kids. You had to both, successful work that was meaningful to you. But you
Yes,
shared in the book that you had a thought. Maybe it started with a dream. You had a
it did.
dream or a thought about
I had a
Mark
premonition.
dying ahead of. Yeah, do you wanna
Yes.
tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I remember, yeah, we're like living the American dream with the happy marriage and the healthy, beautiful kids and the home and all the things. And about 2 weeks, couple weeks before we found out that Mark was actually really sick with cancer, um, I had this horrible dream. And I describe it in the book, but basically we're cruising along in a convertible. We finally had a day to ourselves and we're just sitting next to each other and happy and laughing. And as we cruise along, all of a sudden the front of the car tipped over a like a precipice and we are falling straight down. And that feeling, I've always hated that sensation of falling.
Yes.
I don't like roller coasters for that
Me
reason.
either. Yeah.
So I'm trying to scream because that's your reaction, right? When this horrible thing happens and you can feel the drop in your stomach. And then I looked across the it became like a valley and I looked across and I saw this mountain that went all the way up into the sky, beyond into the sky. It was so big and it was so huge that I somehow intuited that it was like facing God himself, which was quite a frightening thought because you think, well, only dead people see God, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, generally. And I woke up. And then in that moment, waking up, I thought, what would it be like if Mark wasn't here? I reached over to touch his back just to reassure myself that he was still there because for some reason the fear was centered around Mark. And then about a week before we got his diagnosis, again we had no clue that he was sick. I'm with a friend of mine, and out of the blue, it occurred to me to ask her, Kathy, what's your biggest fear? And she told me, and then she turned the question around and asked me, and I said, I'm afraid something's going to happen to Mark. Why did I think that? That
I
was
know.
just bizarre. And 1 week later, we ended up, Mark thought he had the flu, and it wasn't the flu.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was, remind me how old he was at that time?
He was, it was actually the weekend of his 45th birthday
That's what I thought,
when,
45, because that's similar to
yeah,
Eric.
right.
45, very serious, aggressive stomach cancer, right?
Yes. And by the time it was diagnosed, it was stage 4. So I
Okay.
think our his survival, statistics were 2%.
Yeah.
And we did chemo and we did all the things for 19 months. They gave him a they gave him a 2% chance of survival.
Even with all of the
Yeah.
interventions that they tried. And so
Actually,
you had, oh, go ahead.
they call it salvage therapy. Isn't that awful?
So disgusting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to keep him alive and
Yeah.
surviving as much as he could. Yeah.
Right.
And so, I think about this often when I talk with people who have young children at home. Obviously, usually it's with a spouse loss, but in whatever case, or grandchildren, because you had young children at home at the time,
Yes.
teens and young. How old were your kiddos at that time? Ish.
When he died, they were 10, 14, and 16.
Okay.
So, Carson
Oh,
was 8
yeah. When the
when he was
diagnosis happened.
diagnosed. He was too
Okay.
young to, I mean, they yeah.
Yeah. But I think I asked this because, I was just talking with Penny Smith, sometimes known to people as hospice nurse Julie, earlier today. And though we didn't touch on how to talk to kids, part of what we were talking about as we both work to create a more grief literate and death literate, you know, world is how we use language. Do we use like the D word, or do we use euphemisms like fell asleep or went to a better place? And how do we talk to people so that we can spend the time together in the most quality way we can spend the time, knowing that life is precious, because newsflash, 100% of us are not making it out of here.
Mhm.
But with kids, it's hard, though you had teens and tweens. So curious how you decided, or you and Mark together decided, how do we talk to the kids? In case anybody's listening in that place now, how did you think about how you would talk to the kids about the diagnosis, the prognosis, how you spent that time?
You know what, Lisa? I have to demur on this in that I don't even remember.
Yeah, no, I don't.
It
I
was
don't blame you.
so stressful and frightening, and, there were aspects of what happened that I have to look back and say, "Well, what did we do?"
Yeah,
I mean, it was clear that he was getting sicker, but did they see it? I
right.
mean, it's we tried to do things as a family, um, but it got to the point where he really
I
wasn't.
imagine physically that felt
Yeah.
almost impossible. Yeah.
Well, the first year we were actually able to do things. It was kind of the last 5 months that we weren't. But I almost want to ask my kids, "Do you remember
Yeah.
what we
No,
did?" Um,
I want to assure you and anybody listening, that's not a surprise to me. I only had 2.5 weeks between diagnosis and Eric dying in my arm, and there's so much even about 2.5 weeks that I can't remember. And I just say that to you with such compassion, and to anybody listening who is now wondering themselves, "Oh, how did I talk to, or what did happen?" When someone we love is under great threat, or we are ourselves, we're really in a survival mode. That fight or flight is really taken over. One of the things that goes offline is our need to remember things, right? Because not useful when you're running from a saber-tooth tiger. You just need to survive.
Mhm.
And so I can imagine for that long haul of 19 months, you're trying to engage with hope, you're trying to be present to your husband, you're still parenting your kids, and you're also just in a survival, mode maybe one day to the next. So to not remember those details, I just want to say is makes a lot of sense, you know? Yeah. So thank you for being honest about that. I really, really appreciate that. Yeah. Um, so this time you find yourself, as you said to before, living this sort of dream life, career, family, husband, and then you find yourself in your mid-ish 40s, a widow, which I can attest, I'm assume you, like me, never thought that would be a label
Mm.
or title you thought you would ever have, or certainly not at that age. And a parent to 3 kids, and one of the things you touched on, I wanna make sure we get to is the honesty, and I've touched on it a little bit myself about, like, parenting teenagers, by the way, in the good times
Mm.
is not a trivial is not for the faint of heart, and so to parent them who are going through grief, I think is so profoundly challenging. So I wanna make sure I'm just sort of putting a pin in that to make sure that we come back to that because it's such a common struggle for so many of us, myself included. My daughter was 7, but the teenage years, I think, were definitely more difficult because of the profound grief. But, what you said in the book, which you just mentioned earlier, was you had this inkling or intuition,
Mhm.
maybe not unlike the intuition you had in the dream, pretty early on, it seems to me in the timeline after Mark's death, that um, what does it mean to live fully? And how might I commemorate Mark with how I live my life?
Mhm.
And you said it all started with a Google search.
Yes. So let me back that up a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah.
Of all things, a few months before he died, I had this conversation with Mark, and he bared his heart and said, "I just don't want people to forget me." And that that he said that, it's like it spread eagled itself over my soul to
Yeah.
think, like, how could anyone forget you? I will never forget you. Your patience, you've affected them, you've saved lives, you've touched the family, you have a church family with neighbors, etc. And yet, because he said that, I had maybe more intention than most people that
Yeah.
making sure that he was not forgotten was really important. It was as though he handed me a mission. And so after he died, I did a Google search. How do you remember someone who
Yeah.
died?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sadly, a lot of what you find is a retail experience. You know,
Yes.
buy something, um, put their name on a bench. That's so popular. I don't think
Yeah.
you can go by many benches without seeing in memory of, and or buy a tree or whatever you do, um, commission artwork. And I did some of those things. There's nothing wrong with any of those things,
Yeah. Yeah.
except I realized they're once and done. So you buy the tree or donate in their name or put their name on a plaque, and people go on, and after a while they don't even see it. And so it was constantly on my mind. How do you remember someone who died? And Lisa, I think this is something I feel passionate about, which is when you go through a big loss, there's two bits, there's two parts to it. There's the grief part, and you talk about that so well, but there's also the remembering part. And the remembering part was something that I feel like we haven't done a great job promoting ways to remember someone who died.
Remembering is such an important part of how we navigate living in the world in the wake of loss. Sometimes the remembering part is something you do in the quiet moments to yourself, and some are through storytelling or even more public events. When we come back, Jennifer shares the story of how she stumbled upon what would be the first of many badass ways she found to remember her husband, Mark, and to carry his life and his legacy forward. Hint, it involves a motorcycle license. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. Today's conversation with Jennifer has me thinking about a passage in my book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss. And while I cover a lot about the nature of memory, remembering practices in grief, and more in the chapter entitled Memories for Safekeeping, one of the things I touch on that I don't think gets talked about enough is the both and of how remembering at times can feel, well, both amazing and excruciating. Here's a little excerpt from the section called Hurry Back and Go Away. Sometimes remembering hurts too much. I think writer Haruki Murakami captured the duality of our relationship with memories and grief so beautifully when he wrote, "Memories warm you up from the inside, but they also tear you apart." Our memories are all we have left of the person we lost. That makes the memories sacred, something to savor and hold dear. It's in the memories that we can feel closest to the ones we've lost. We hear their laugh, see their smile, feel their love. It's also in their memory that the pain of their absence is greatest. Memories will bring you both joy and heartache. This is another reminder to honor the both and of grief. Sometimes our memories pour out of us in unexpected ways at unplanned times. Sometimes they don't take the shape of storytelling. Sometimes there are tears. As author Ruth Ozeki wrote in her beautiful novel, A Tale for Time Being, sometimes when she told stories about the past, her eyes would get teary from all the memories she had. But they weren't tears. She wasn't crying. They were just the memories leaking out. If you like being read to and Grief Brain has made reading feel hard, first of all, been there, done that. But don't worry, I got you covered because I personally recorded an audiobook version of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch just for you. You can get your copy on Audible or wherever you shop for your audiobooks. And thanks to Penguin Random House and an amazingly talented Spanish-speaking voiceover artist, soon you'll be able to listen to it in Spanish too.
And one day, I would start most mornings at the kitchen table with my journal and a box of tissues. And as I'm doing that, one morning, a few months after he died, his funeral program fell out, and I saw that, the back of it with the live fully, laugh often thing. And I thought, live fully. What does that even mean? Because I want to die. I really just wish I wouldn't wake up. And I'm certainly not modeling live fully for my kids. What would live fully even look like? And as though an answer to prayer at that moment, I thought, what about that scooter that's sitting in the garage? When Mark was sick, we had gotten him this little Vespa scooter that he could ride, just so he'd have some way to get outside. And he'd gotten to ride it for a good 9 months before it just became too much. And because it can go up to 50 miles an hour, you need a motorcycle license to ride it on the street. And so after he stopped riding it, it just sat in the garage and was gathering dust. And as I'm thinking about that live fully, and for some reason I remembered the scooter, I went out to have a look. And there it was in all its little glory. I mean, those things are so cute. But it was gathering dust and boxes were starting to hide it. And I looked at it and you know how you might remember a scene from a movie?
Yeah.
In Roman Holiday, I think it's Audrey Hepburn, goes scooting around through Rome on a Vespa.
Rome. Yes.
Right. And I mean, literally, it's like you can get on, move forward, literally move forward. And I thought, well, what if I got a motorcycle license? Is that living fully? I think it is. And so that was my first foray into doing adventures in Mark's memory and in his honor. And it was something else because I wasn't in my 40s when he died. I turned 50 2 weeks after he died, which was another level of suck, I have to say.
Right. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
just like, "What?" Oh,
This,
yeah.
yeah.
So I'm doing this motorcycle course, and I'm this 50-year-old, and mostly it was guys in their 20s, and, I come strolling up, and I'm thinking like, "Oh my, I don't feel like I fit in." But everybody was really nice, and when I got through the course and passed and I got my motorcycle license, the instructor walked over to us after we had to do all the exercises, and he said, "You all passed, and 2 of you got perfect scores." I got a perfect score. And when you
Ace.
said that, everybody came over and they're, like, thumping me on the back, and I'm thinking, like, I felt genuinely happy.
Yeah.
And for a moment, I really did, and I hadn't felt happy in almost 3 years since he had, gotten his diagnosis. And that happiness gave me hope. And it was after that I decided every year in Mark's honor, I'm gonna do some big thing that scares me. And that's
Mm.
how I began the adventures, and I've now done
Yeah.
18 things.
I was gonna say, we've got a list. We're not gonna get through all of them today, but I mean,
Yes.
you all, we're talking hella skiing and,
Trapeze
competing on a
school.
stage, trapeze school, like so many things. I do wanna get to some of them, but I appreciate, I'm sort of wanting to go back and forth between sort of like how you lived in his honor and moving forward and processing your grief and also the realities of being a grieving mother. I mean, griever who's a mother and also having to navigate that. But something you just said there, I want to call out for the listeners, which is this first time you're happy.
Mm,
And what a amazing, beautiful, as you said, often hopeful, but
mhm.
often tinged with, not always, but often tinged with guilt
Yes,
or, defeat. Like, how am I allowed to be happy? And so for you to have that still seared in your memory, and as you tell it now all these years later, that first moment of happiness also led to a foundational feeling of like, okay, there's a chance I'm gonna be okay.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think it was the sense of accomplishment. Um, I started that motorcycle course. I didn't even know how to get on a motorcycle and, turn the thing on. So to go
Yeah.
from that to weaving through cones and downshifting and stopping
Yeah.
and it was on a regular sized motorcycle, not a Vespa, that you took
Yeah.
the course. That it was a real sense of overcoming a major challenge and feeling good about that.
Which is so profoundly important. And listeners, take right from Jennifer, although you don't have to go get a motorcycle license if you don't want to. But I think the getting of the motorcycle license is this, to me, as I hear it, a metaphor of a couple of things. One is find, which I say all the time on this show, find agency. Find some place in your life where
Mhm.
you can do something, like you have control over something. Because the thing about loss in these ways is that something happened to us that was out of our
Yes.
control. And that can really, not just science nerd out, but that can just do a number on our nervous system, but also existentially, like,
Yes.
what do I have control over? And so I think there's something really powerful in that piece. And also there was some structure, which you talk about the theme throughout the book. One of the things also we lose when we experience a profound loss. I would say most kinds of profound death losses, anyways, but certainly with a spouse loss. So we lose structure to our days. If it was somebody who was in your day to day life. And I think for all profound loss, we can lose this sense of purpose. And even though that wasn't your life's purpose, quote unquote, which we talk about now in our modern culture, everybody has to live their
Yes.
fullest life purpose. It was a purpose. And to
Yeah.
just sometimes have a purpose is enough. I don't know if you found that. Like, it doesn't have to be the
Absolutely.
purpose.
Yes. I
Yeah.
think
That
that I'm sorry, the idea of purpose can get you through the week or through the month. And initially, my goals, I would set goals because I'm a goal setter and that's how
yeah.
I feel,
Yeah.
it's nice to check off a box, but it can be
Yeah.
like I will clean out one drawer. I will
Brush my teeth. I don't even understand how I brushed
What
my
a
teeth or showered for the first few weeks. I don't remember that at all. Yeah.
yes, because you're on the floor grieving.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do get that. I
Yeah.
love something you always say, Lisa. You say you're an "and" person, and
Yeah.
for you, it usually means first acknowledging what is good and then pointing out what sucks.
Yeah.
And I remember that for me, at least, life in the wake of Mark's death, in the immediacy of it, it was so the reverse.
Yeah.
So much
Yeah.
of it sucked. And then I needed to honor and remember him, and that might be the "and" part. And I think that's often how it is for many people who grieve.
Yeah.
So much of it is frightening and sad and depressing. And it's okay to acknowledge that all those things are happening. And yet you can still remember your person.
Yeah.
Find a way to think about them, remember them.
Absolutely. Yeah, my and is often that. It's often because we're so quick to try to culturally sweep those hard feelings under the rug and go to the happy that I invite people to pause with, acknowledging the hard thing, as you said. And I do think that, especially when we're in early grief, which reminder listeners can look very different for different people. So I'm not coming to you with a timeline there. But I think in our early, messy middle of grief, um, it feels impossible some days to see anything, to see delight, to be in a space of wonder or awe, to have a moment of gratitude, to see the positive remembrance. And every time we remember our person, it's the pain of losing them. And so it does take, whether it's a motorcycle lesson or any tool, it does take an intentional effort, right? To
Mhm.
say, like, can I notice one thing or remember one thing or acknowledge one thing? And that's can be the and. It doesn't have to
Mm,
be balanced. It can be, if you're having a day where it's 90 hard things and
yes.
one neutral. Sometimes I say in the beginning, we're not even looking for joy. We're not looking for happiness. Maybe we're looking for ease,
Mm,
or maybe our goal is neutrality,
mm.
you know? Yeah.
I know,
You,
go ahead.
well, I just, this is reminding me of, there was a passage in the book where you sort of talk about the father he was, which of course was an involved, caring, incredible father, very much reminded me of Eric for sure. But
Mhm.
then your next chapter was sort of like 9 years later, the sort of mother I was.
Oh, not so good.
Yeah. Which, again, so many of us can relate to. But I wanted to read this short passage because it speaks to the kind of, a little bit what we were just touching on, which was sort of the existential crisis in a way, because we don't just lose our person, we lose the versions of ourselves that we were when that person was alive, and our sense of ourselves, our own identity, our sense of our purpose, you
Yes.
know, how we operate. I mean, like, how you were a mother when you had an alive spouse, of course, is different than how you're a mother when your spouse is dead. And yet we kind of hold ourselves to, that standard. So I just thought this was really beautifully, vulnerably open, and I wanted to share it with our listeners as a little teaser because they can go pick up a copy of the book themselves. But you said Mark's death opened an inlet port to some existential central vacuum inside of me, and I felt as if my soul was being sucked out. All that remained was a hollow and rusted hull of my former life. I was acutely aware of being hugged by a tight sense of fragility and random tragedy. I stared into the ceiling at night, then struggled to heave myself from under the covers the next morning. I couldn't figure out how or why I was supposed to survive the wretchedness. Not knowing what else to do, I cried constantly, the wet tissues in my hands bearing tears of helplessness, fear, hopelessness, and grief as I tried to mechanically continue the routine of making meals, driving kids where they needed to go, and maintaining the household. Our children hid in their rooms or went to hang out at their friends' houses to avoid seeing their pathetic mother. That breaks my heart for you. Their pathetic mother, and listening to her cry. I understood why, and that made me feel worse. I just bring that into the room. First of all, I have so much, I just want to hug that version of Jennifer.
Yeah.
It just moves me. And also because I can relate so much. But what do you think about when you look back at that version of Jennifer, that moment in time? And maybe if you can, this is just a very spontaneous question. It's okay if you don't have the answer, but
Okay.
how, knowing what you know now, all these years later, and that grief is messy and takes its time and has its way with us, and our only job is to sort of bow down and let it pass through us. What might you say to that version of Jennifer in comfort all these years later, knowing what you know? When we come back, Jennifer offers up the comforting and straightforward words she would give to that early grieving version of herself, or to anyone, which might include you, if you're in the early phase of grieving someone you love. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. Friends, I don't know about you, but I feel like life is happening so fast. I want a place where we can slow down and dive in deeper and figure out how to metabolize it all together. And I'd love to have you join me. That's why I'm building a community on Substack called AFGO with Lisa Keefauver. Now, AFGO, if you haven't heard me talk about it on the show or in my book or from the stage, it stands for Another Fucking Growth Opportunity. Yeah, of course. I had to get in a judicious use of cuffing. Yes, of course. I had to get in a judicious use of cussing. But rest assured, my friends, like I do in all my work, I'm going to show up authentically as me, messy and all. But I'll be there to also offer thoughtful, meaningful, and practical guidance on how we can center aliveness in a world full of loss. I look forward to your comments, our chats, creating special audio and video content for you, and so much more. And don't worry, if you like things delivered to your inbox without having to search the web for it, AFGO with Lisa Keefauver will be delivered directly to you. You can head to Substack and find me, AFGO with Lisa Keefauver, or find the link directly on my website, lisakeefauver.com.
Whether I say it to myself or to that mom or person
Yeah.
who's out there right now going through
Yeah.
that horrible part,
Yeah.
is that just hold on. That's all you can do. Um, I don't think there is shame in that, and I would put my arm around anyone going through it now and just say, "It is hard. It does totally suck, and I'll sit with you and let you cry.
Yeah.
I'll just stand here and be with you silently." There's a, concept that was in Viktor Frankl's book.
Mhm.
He was the Holocaust survivor who wrote, Man's Search for Meaning, and it's something about it's called tragic optimism. The idea is that in the midst of devastating grief, it can seem that resilience is beyond our capacity to even grasp, but it doesn't remain that way eventually, and it might take a long time depending on who you are and what you've been through. But
Yeah.
eventually, there will come a time, there will come a day where you can lift your head a little bit and you have a choice to make.
Yeah.
What am I going to do with this?
Yeah.
Um, it took
Thank you.
2
That's
years. Yeah. What am I gonna do with this? For me, I think it took 2 years till I was able to decide it's time to get back up. It's
okay.
time to figure out what to do, and that's when I decided to go back to school. But in the meantime, little short-term goals got me through.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I love that piece by Viktor Frankl. So much
Yeah.
wisdom in Man's Search for Meaning. And I appreciate you, the way that you spoke to either that version of yourself, or which is hard for a lot of us, or at least to the version of somebody that might be listening. And I think I just want to amplify and highlight how important that is that especially if you're the friend of somebody who's in that place, our job is not to fix them. Our job is not to drag them out of that place. Our job is to accompany them with deep, knowing and compassion, as you said, and sit alongside them. You can bring them a meal, you can invite them on a walk, you can keep showing up. But we all have to have our own way through. And I want to recognize, because so often when we show the stories of grieving people, we show
Mhm.
them 10, 15, 18 years down the road, and they're have a podcast, they've become a nurse, like we kind of show the shiny parts, and I think although we're doing it better more and more in media with different shows and movies out there, I just appreciated the honesty, the vulnerability, and the commonality. I've seen a version of that passage I just read to you in every single person I've ever worked with. I've experienced it in my own grief. And I think to show that to the world, even though now they're hearing about somebody who went hella skiing and learned how to motorcycle and,
Yeah.
you know, ran a medical clinic in South America and became a nurse and, did all the things, it's important to know that we too, you too, every griever grieving a profound loss has been there. And your only job, as you said, is to just take another breath, take
Mhm.
a sip of water, get a little sleep, ask for a hug, and start over again. Yeah. Just day by day. Yeah.
I think it's important that we all remind ourselves that every path of progress and growth includes times of hopelessness. And yes, I got the motorcycle license, and then the next day I might have been on the floor just weeping. So it's
Exactly.
not even that it's a continued path of
Yes.
upward on to the
Yes.
next adventure. It was stop, start for years,
Absolutely.
for absolute
Yes.
years, Lisa. And
This is
that's
what I'm saying is the messy, nonlinear journey of grief.
yes, that's it. So I have this quote from a former Navy SEAL. It says, "No one escapes pain, fear, and suffering, yet from pain can come wisdom, from fear can come courage, and from suffering can come strength, if we have the virtue of resilience." But again, resilience might not come right away. It
Yeah.
could take a time
Yes.
of healing that might involve years.
Yes. Thank you for that. And thank you for reminding us of resilience while also qualifying it, because I think, like so many, I remember talking to Lizzie Cleary about this years ago, who's a psychologist who works in grief, oncology, and loss, and many people, is that, and I would label myself as somebody who experienced resilience and has had resilience. And yet, I think, like we do so much in our culture, we somehow then use it as a moral badge. Like, you have to be resilient and it has to look a certain way and it needs to come at a certain time, or that the prize is, don't worry, you'll be resilient. Like, you wouldn't trade it all back for Mark to be here again. And so I appreciate so much, Jennifer, the way you sort of reminded us that sometimes it's not going to look like resilience. It's just going to look like crying in bed. And then maybe the next day it's going to be setting a really short little goal for our day to shower or get dressed. But that resilience to me comes when it comes. It does require our effort, but it also rarely happens. It doesn't ever happen in one action. Resilience is a result of a series of actions, sometimes inactions, decisions, attending to your grief. It doesn't just magically appear, which is why it'll take the time that it takes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also learned something in the process of writing the book, Badass Grief, which was so now it's been 18 years since Mark died. And I wrote the book. It came out in March, last March. In the process of writing the book is how I discovered the pattern of seeing my own growth. I hadn't seen it until I went to write about it. And then
Yes.
even in the process of writing and editing and talking to a concept editor who started to say, "Hey, did you notice a pattern here?" And I'm
Yeah.
like, "No, I didn't. I didn't
Yeah.
realize." And I didn't realize how far I had come, and until I thought about it, I didn't realize specific lessons I had learned through each thing that I challenged myself to do. And rarely do people have that kind of reflective desire. Um, I guess I'm all that to say, I think people are bigger and stronger and more resilient than they might actually realize.
Absolutely, I agree, and you're touching on something that I talk often about with my clients, and again, I just wanna caveat everything I say to my clients, by the way, I have said and continue to say to myself, so I am also my own client. I see somebody else, but, like, these lessons aren't, like they're not coming from on high, they're coming from my own, mistakes and practices and learnings. Is exactly what you said. So often, especially early on, we're just surviving. But even
Yes.
just in life, you think like, I'm going to get the next promotion. Then you got the promotion. You're busy focusing on the next thing. We are not a culture of pause. We are not a cult because we are a culture of productivity. And so we're often evolving, growing, maturing, moving further along our grief
Exactly.
path, moving forward, but we don't know it because you're just in it. You're just in your life. So what I say often to my clients, this is dates me, it shows my age, but I'll say when they'll say something that I realize I've been working for them, and that is something an action they took or perspective they had that I know for sure they did not have when I started working with,
Mhm, mhm,
or a moment, I had my first happy moment or whatever the thing is that they're sharing. And I say, can we just pause
mhm.
and take a Polaroid? For those of you who are young, that was a picture. I think they have them back again where you took a picture and it
Yeah.
produced an actual film piece of paper with your picture on it. I think now they have imitations again. But anyhow, I would say that often. I say that often to your point exactly, which is we so rarely pause that we have these moments of, and I don't want to call them improvement because you weren't a bad person before, but like where there's more ease, maybe there's more joy,
Growth.
maybe you're having
Yeah.
growth, right?
You've grown, you've
It's
changed, you've
so
evolved.
important to do it because not because now this is the platform from which you will always operate. You might come down again. You might have a day of hard. You will have a day of hard, right? But now you know this is possible.
Yes.
And so to take that snapshot, to take that Polaroid, to take that pause as you're talking about, or, you could decide to write a memoir, but even if you're not ready to write a memoir, to pause and to reflect on what are the versions of me that a month ago or a year ago couldn't have imagined that this version of me is capable of doing or gets to
Absolutely.
do or gets to enjoy.
Mhm, mhm. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
The weight and the heaviness of the intensity of our grief emotions, the anger, the sorrow, the longing, the despair are so heavy, and I call them tricky,
Mm.
that when they come over you, when that wave comes over you and you find yourself on the floor, you know, keening and wailing and they convince you that you've always felt this way and you're always going to feel this way. And when you have some of those Polaroid moments, it's like a counterweight to that idea that you're always going to feel this way because you can sort of pull that out of your proverbial back pocket and say, well, wait a minute. I actually do have sometimes days where I'm not laid low by grief. Does that resonate for you at all of kind of leaning into those moments of spark to help get you through?
It does resonate. I mean, what I certainly hear you when you say the weight of the grief, which for me slid into depression, was so heavy. It felt like when the lifting it off me for even a little bit
Yeah.
took enormous effort, and yet it's not as though it never happened. It did happen occasionally. Find, however, that at least for me, maybe others don't choose to talk about it, is that those things continued, that feeling would descend for years. It wasn't this, "Oh, it's been a year, get on with it."
No.
I think when I hear or talk to someone who says, "My person died 3 years ago," and I try to reassure them, "This is still new grief. You get a
Yeah.
pass in my book
Yeah.
anyway."
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Oh, I so appreciate that. And again, it does look different for everybody. I know for sure a year to 2 years in, you're, I mean, I don't want to make anybody feel despair. This is really meant to be like, you still have a grieving body. You still have a grieving brain. You are still grieving as learning. You are still learning how to operate in a world without a manual. And to your point, the reason to know that or to name that out loud or to offer that to somebody in year 2 or year 3 or et cetera is as a permission giving.
Yes,
Like,
that's all.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it's a kind of
Like
permission giving. Yeah,
that it's okay
yeah,
to still feel pretty bad about it.
yeah.
But
Um,
I was going to say that one thing I like to, as someone who's been through it, it's so nice when you meet someone who's further down the road in their grief journey. And I had always hoped to find someone like that and never did. And now it feels like an honor and almost a privilege to be that person for
yes.
someone else because we all need hope. Do you remember that
Yeah.
movie, It's a Wonderful Life?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so at the beginning of the movie, there's this angel second class, Clarence. He wants to get his wings, and he's supposed to help this guy, George Bailey, right?
Yes.
And when the angel giving him the assignment says, "You gotta help George Bailey," and he says, "Why? Is he sick?" And the superior angel says, "No, it's worse. He's discouraged."
Mm,
So the angel recognizes we all need hope, and
yeah,
sometimes in grief, it feels like hope is just beyond us.
yeah,
And that's why I think it's important to connect with others who've been through grief, who are maybe a little bit further down the road, someone who's found a way to re-engage. And in a way, you offer that too, Lisa, through your community here, through sharing with people. Um, and we can bear today if we think tomorrow will be a little better, we can bear it. Gives us that.
yeah.
And I think
The hope.
as people who have already endured grief, we can offer hope to those who are newly grieving.
Yeah. Jennifer, I can't think of a better way to end our conversation today. That was so beautiful. That was such a powerful reminder um, about how we are all, I mean, as Ram Dass said, walking each other home, like we can all be walking alongside one another and to be a beacon of hope for somebody. Um, minus the toxic positivity, but just with the companionship and the offerings and the insight and the permission giving to be exactly where you are, exactly as you are. You are so loved exactly as you are. And if you're listening today somewhere in that early grief, and maybe you don't have someone personally in your life, I want to invite you to reach out to me and to listen to this show, to find folks in your community too, and to remember that there are people who are a little further down the road, as Jennifer said, who can offer you that glimmer of hope. And some days that's, just what we need. So, Jennifer, thank you for writing your book. Listeners, I'm going to drop a link in the show notes. It's called Badass Grief, Changing Gears, Moving Forward. You're going to have to get the book to learn about how she donned a bikini and entered a fitness competition in Vegas, how she went heli skiing, learned how to trap, became a Toastmaster, became a nurse, a whole
Mm,
second career we didn't even get to today because we got into so much other beautiful material. But
cute.
you'll see the pattern of her life. This woman is moving forward for sure. Jennifer Hassel, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for allowing me to be your guest.
As I mentioned as we close, you've got to pick up a copy of this book. In addition to shifting careers and becoming a nurse after years of being a lawyer, she also went on to do some amazing, brave, and courageous things as a way to honor Mark's legacy and find purpose and direction in her life. You can pick up a copy of Badass Grief wherever you shop for your favorite books. And you can also learn more about Jennifer and how she's showing up for other grievers too by visiting jenniferhassel.com. Did you love today's conversation? Did you learn something new? Have you been listening to the show for a long time and loving it? Well, if so, I'd love to have you help ensure that this show gets out to other grievers who might need it too. So you can do that by leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening or watching this episode. As always, I have to thank my friend Giles Smith of Alafia Sounds for the music. All right, my grieving friends. Yes, grief is a sneaky bitch, but remember, I've got your back. Until next time, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.